If you're comfortable finishing all 6 items in your build and you want to look for a way to improve your gameplay, you might want to learn how to make traps. Finishing your 6 core gear pieces is the most important thing in the game, and it should always be your focus at the start of each game. But after you finish your gear, you kind of have a lot of free time, and you can use that time to either make food, chase fights, or in this case, make traps. Now, the reason why you want to make traps in the first place is because it gives you an advantage that other people in the lobby may not have. It also can give you the element of surprise in a lot of fights that will catch people off guard and potentially turn fights that you shouldn't have won to begin with into one that favors you. If you feel like the people you're up against, either you're outnumbered or their gear is just better than yours, or it's a bad matchup, if those are situations you're dealing with, traps can give you a heavy-handed advantage that really you shouldn't have had in the first place. So you're sold on the idea of traps, you know you want to make some, but you don't know which ones you should focus on, or why you should focus on them. Traps can be divided into 2 main categories. There's contact traps, and then there's detonation time traps. Contact traps are traps like double guillotines, claymores, and mithril string. These are traps that will instantly damage or apply some sort of CC effect to the first thing that touches them. These traps are really good for setting up in advance and using for ambushes or stunning people in areas that leaves them very vulnerable to follow-up CC or big burst. Since the damage on these traps comes out instantly, there's no way you can actually bait out this kind of damage, similar to the detonation time traps where you can. So one of the biggest advantages of these traps is that the damage just cannot be baited. Now, the other main category of traps is explosion traps or detonation time traps. These are traps such as remote mines, smart bombs, and C4. So the way these traps work is if an enemy gets in the trigger radius of the trap, it will cause a timed explosion. A big ring will extend out to the edge of it, showing the range at which it will explode, and then it will explode, dealing damage to everything inside of it. Unlike collision traps, these detonation timer traps can hit multiple enemies at the same time. So to account for the fact that they can do so much AoE damage to multiple targets, their downside is that since it is a timed explosion, it is possible to bait out the trap by triggering it and then just jumping out or running out of the radius before it explodes. Now, let's talk about specific traps and why you should choose them in specific situations. Starting from the rarest and most relevant traps, we're going to talk about smart bombs and remote mines first. Smart bombs and remote mines are the only yellow tier traps, and they are very similar in function, yet have their own unique properties that differentiates the two of them. Remote mines craft out of a force core and a spiked plank, and a spiked plank is just a mouse trap plus a nail. It's one of the easiest traps to make despite being a yellow tier trap, because a force core is a guaranteed drop off of wick every single game, and a spiked plank isn't too difficult to craft, especially in Avenue where wick spawns every game. Now, remote mines actually have a special hidden property that's different from every other trap in the game. They can be placed from far away, much farther than every other trap. Why this is important is because it gives ranged characters a chance to place traps in combat, especially powerful traps in combat, when other traps would normally be far too dangerous for them to place because they'd have to get too close to enemies. There's just a lot of situations in general where having this very long trap placement range lets you really surprise your opponents and put traps where they're not expecting them to be. Now, the other yellow tier trap is smart bombs. Compared to remote mines, smart bombs have a far more complicated build path. But a lot of the stuff in its build path can be found on animals around the map. Wolves drop blueprints and electronic parts, and bears can drop cell phones. And even Wickeline herself can also drop a cell phone, giving you even more chances to sometimes just RNG half the build path pretty quickly. Smart bombs have 2 unique properties that are different from every other trap in the game. The first one is that their trigger radius is larger than every other trap, and their fuse timer is half of that of every other explosion / detonation time trap in the game. Now, if you're looking for sort of a budget explosion option that's not remote mines or smart bombs, you can always look towards C4, which is basically the same recipe as the smart bomb, but instead of the cell phone, you just replace it with some chalk. C4 is not a bad option to mass produce explosion traps. It's easier to make than smart bombs, and the damage isn't that much different. It just loses that larger detonation range and also that shorter fuse time. And if you're looking for a budget explosion option, you do always have fire traps as well, which are even easier to mass produce. However, they do less damage and they're very easy to bait out. And that covers it for all of the important explosion traps slash detonation timer traps. On the other side of the spectrum, let's talk about collision traps. The two most important collision slash contact traps are double guillotines and claymores. Now, unlike the differences between remote mines and smart bombs, the differences between double guillotines and claymores are just not that numerous. They're pretty similar traps. Double guillotines have about 23% more damage than claymores. But the thing is that claymores, they bring a 1-second stun, whereas double guillotines only bring a 1-second root. And stunning is generally the more powerful effect. Additionally, as sort of just an extra point in favor of claymores have a much smaller model, which some characters cannot actually auto-attack if they have really short range, whereas double guillotine's model is quite large, which makes it able to be auto-attacked by everybody without necessarily triggering it. Now, that being said, the damage on double guillotines being so much higher than claymores is another huge advantage, because the damage on these traps will be increased by up to potentially 80% depending on trap mastery of the person using it. And that damage can scale to a huge difference between double guillotines and claymores. Now, when it comes to actually making double guillotines are actually some of the easiest traps in the game to make. Despite their power, you can actually 2-zone them between Pond and Temple. You can finish the entire pendulum axe within Pond and then just move to Temple to pick up knives to finish all of your jungle guillotines. Oftentimes, if I find myself with some spare time in a match and I see that both Pond and Temple are still open, there's a good chance you'll catch me going between Pond and Temple and just finishing a bunch of double guillotines for free. Now, if Temple's closed, you don't necessarily have to use that for your knives. You could also go to Hotel or Dock for your knives as well. Keep in mind that Temple, Hotel, and Dock, they only have about 4 to 5 knives each. So if you're just going to be hitting one knife zone, you only have to bring about 4 pendulum axes out of Pond. Alternatively, if Pond is closed, you can also make them between Hotel, Beach, and Forest, but that's a 3-zone. There's a bunch of ways you can make these traps, but those are the ones that I mostly pay attention to. When it comes to making claymores, there's no clean 2-zone way in the same way that you can do Pond for double guillotines. At the minimum, you're going to be going to 3 different zones, but luckily the materials that you need aren't super heavily contested. The only thing you need a lot of is gunpowder. Essentially, all you need to know is that 3 gunpowder can be converted into 4 claymores. It's not the cleanest conversion in the world, but you're going to need 3 gunpowder per 4 claymores. The other materials needed for claymores are really easy to get. Snares, glue, mousetraps, those are found in a lot of places. Getting a lot of gunpowder is really the only challenge for making a lot of claymores. Now, as for the other contact traps, the ones we should probably bring up are Sting Burst, Hidden Maidens, and Mithril String. Sting Burst simply is not very good. If you have an RDX, you're way better off just using it with chalk to make some C4 or with a cell phone to make some smart bombs. Getting 1 Sting Burst for an entire RDX is simply not worth it. The only thing you use a Sting Burst for is making pedal torrents. Now, Hidden Maidens. Hidden Maidens are a relatively slept-on trap. They're actually incredibly easy to make. But the issue comes from the fact that if you're making jungle guillotines or if you're making spike planks, there's probably just better traps you could be using those with than Hidden Maidens. Because Hidden Maidens, they just have a very small radius, so there's a good chance that if you place a bunch down, your opponents might not even touch them to begin with. And finally, we have Mithril String, which is actually a pretty good and relevant trap. Mithril String is an excellent way of using your extra mithril that you have laying around. If you don't necessarily want to make mithril gear, if it doesn't fit your build, or if for some reason you just have a bunch of extra mithril, you just combine it with a piano wire and you get 3 free traps that do quite a lot of damage. They just have a small radius and they have no CC effect to go with them, but the free damage is nice if you just have extra mithril. At a relatively low cost of production, Mithril String is still a very good trap simply because it doesn't really take that many materials and you probably just have extra mithril laying around anyways. Now, there's one thing that's relatively slept on about traps that most people actually don't know, despite it being a really important part of traps and why they're so good. And that is the fact that all trap damage is actually true damage. It cannot be reduced in any way. Additionally, trap mastery is actually really easy to farm. You can get level 20 just by hitting a couple enemies with traps. And when you get level 20, that gives you an 80% damage boost to all of your traps, an 80% damage boost to your true damage traps. And that just about covers my overview of traps. If this information helped you out in any way, I'd love to hear about it. But in any case, I will see you guys in the next video.